Appreciate that.
And it's recording and you guys are ready to go.
Alrighty.
Great. Good
sorry.
afternoon.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next session. My name is Steve Donahoe, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Some ground rules. This session will be recorded and will be available on the conference website in the next day or so. And we would ask you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask your questions. And then I will direct them to our speaker at the end of her presentation. So our speaker today is Dorothy Eng, Executive Director at Code for Canada. Her topic will be entitled Technology and Design for the Public Good. At Code Canada, Dorothy works with governments, nonprofits, and corporations to develop public interest technologies, which make the delivery of services to the public more effective, efficient, and better to meet people where they are at. She is passionate about putting users at the center of public service, design, development, and policymaking, using data and metrics to inform decision-making and running small experiments to help scale up the right solutions that make real impact, whether those are digital technologies or those deemed to be low tech. Please join me in welcoming Dorothy Eng.
Thanks, Steve. Pleasure to be here. Steve has informed me we'll do a presentation and then open it up to some questions afterwards, and happy to definitely spend a lot more time discussing and answering anybody's questions. And yeah, let's dive right in. So as Steve mentioned, I'm Dorothy, the Executive Director of Code for Canada. We are a national nonprofit on a mission to make technology work for everyone. We believe in harnessing the power of technology, data, and design to improve and strengthen our communities across Canada. And let me tell you how we do that. But first, here we go. I just wanted to cover off a bit about me, just to give you a bit of flavor on my background and where I'm from and why I care about this work. So I am formerly an engineer, went to school for engineering or university, trained as an engineer. I then also was drawn, I've always been drawn to like community impact and making an impact in, not just my community, also my like local neighborhood. So I pursued a master's in business in nonprofit management. I, at the same time, kind of went into product management in the kind of technology delivery space. So I've always been really passionate about this intersection of like technology and public benefits. I was an early organizer of the civic tech movement in Canada. And so along with my team at Code for Canada, I advocate for leveraging technology to create meaningful change in communities. Code for Canada is a national organization with team members across the country. However, I'm coming to you today from my hometown in Toronto, which is the traditional and present day territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. So it's a pleasure to be here with you today. So at Code for Canada, we believe, is our vision, we believe that everyone deserves access to equitable, inclusive, and responsive public services that meet them where they're at. And we're working really hard to make this a reality. But we're not doing it alone. So our governments, have that same belief, which is why we partner with them on their digital transformation work. So together, technology and government have the power to change lives at scale. I know, most folks here today already understand this deeply. Something else I'm sure we're all aware of is that the rise of misinformation to growing political divides and, following a debilitating global pandemic, which has exacerbated many long-standing social issues. We've noticed that not just in Canada, but like globally, people's trust in democratic governments has really taken a hit. And, you know, again, sadly, like Canada is no exception in this case. And to kind of top it off, our Westminster government system operates on people's trust. So the public trust fuels the government engine. So without it, things start to fall apart. A major contributing factor to the breakdown of trust in government here in Canada is that despite our shared beliefs in providing equitable, inclusive, responsive, digital public services that meet people where they're at, the reality is that public service delivery of services is not really keeping pace with an increasingly digital world and really those public needs and expectations of kind of digital first and digital centric. And yet, you know, this is the same country where, with a few exceptions, you can get best in class private sector products and services, you know, from taxi rides to dinner on demand, which, you know, makes us kind of scratching our heads, leaving many Canadians asking, why can't our public services be that intuitive and seamless? Politicians and public servants can tell people to trust them, and obviously strong service delivery is on its way, but ultimately actions speak louder than words, especially for those most vulnerable populations who rely on public services the most. Every time someone encounters a public service that fails to meet them where they're at, that they essentially lose a little bit of trust in government. And the average person doesn't identify and blame a particular level of government or a specific department or ministry. You know, when it comes to, you think of like transit or it's healthcare, social services, all of these are the government to most people. So, you know, every time someone struggles with collecting their benefits or renewing a license, that trust in the government entity, whether it's bureaucracies or, you know, politicians, they all just kind of get lumped into government, and their trust in government erodes. So, you know, coming now to our work at Code for Canada, what we've realized is that the private sector figured out a long time ago that it's much easier to sell things that their customers have helped to design. So, you know, if you think of some of the most successful companies, private sector companies, especially tech companies, a lot of them design and build products and services by centering on user needs, first and always, full stop. So, you know, they invest in teams, they invest in in-house capacity to do deep user research, you know, actually like going out to users and asking them, what are their challenges? What are their pain points? What are their needs? And then using that data to then identify a problem or an opportunity that the company can then say like, hey, there's a gap in the market, there's a need among our customers, and let's, you know, develop this product or service or modify an existing one to make that fit. Companies are also, private sector companies, especially a lot of tech companies, are really good at usability testing. They, you know, are constantly building things to test them in order to learn and improve. It's a constant and very tight and diligent cycle of building to get feedback and to learn. So this kind of buy-in of bringing users along the whole journey of creation of a product, you know, it makes it hard for users to even think, like they can't even really remember a time without that purchase or that product having been in their lives. It really just fits seamlessly into their lives. So if we kind of bring it back to governments, if government services are going to fit seamlessly into Canadians' lives, they really need to adopt this same kind of user-centered or user-focused mindset in the design and development of services. So how do you do design for everyone? How do you build with everyone? At Code for Canada, we're advocates of not just user experience design, but inclusive design. So inclusive design is inherently human-centered. It recognizes that exclusion exists in a lot of processes and a lot of through biases, through existing frameworks and approaches, and it aims to expose those realities of exclusion, and then aims to include people by learning from diversity and empathy, so it can extend to solutions to everyone. So a basic example is a building entrance. Instead of narrowing a set of stairs to accommodate a narrow wheelchair ramp, why not make the entire entrance an attractive, wide, barrier-free slope that everyone can use? Inclusive design is an approach that is people-centered, it's data-driven, it's usable, and it's accessible. And again, is for everyone, not just for some people, but for all. Designing for the majority isn't good enough. And that's what that's what the private sector does very well. They segment their customers into their ideal customer segments, so maybe the ones that are most profitable, the ones that are most likely to buy, the ones that are easier to design for. But when you're talking about public services, designing for the majority isn't good enough. But what public service can do is that by receiving input from diverse perspectives and backgrounds, it allows for the ability to create solutions that really do truly solve for all, not just for some. So it's not just the right thing to do. By testing with users, you're looking to serve early and often. And you can also, there's a lot of good benefits that come from usability testing and inclusive usability testing. You reduce effort, you save on money and cost. And ultimately, you impact lives, ultimately changing a frustrating experience, turning that frustration into joy for people using your products and services. So despite what some cynics might think, folks in the public sector have grasped this concept. Worldwide, governments are mandating that their public services not only get to know their users, but to design services with them to ensure that they are inclusive and that they are designed for everyone. So Canada is no exception. So you'll see this is an image of the digital ambition. And part of the digital ambition for 2022 is to embed the Government of Canada's digital service standards into every policy, program, service that departments across the Government of Canada are mandated to deliver to users. And you'll notice that, the top line, the top requirement, which is like a standard, the top standard of excellence for, according to the Government of Canada, digital standards is designed with users. But as we just mentioned, unlike the private sector, they can't just target some segments of the population. They need to cater to everyone. So that means like investing in what it takes to build with all people, not just some people. So at Code for Canada, we've observed kind of a negative cycle taking place even among some of the most well-meaning and dedicated public service teams. They want to engage their users in an effort to meet mandates, but for various reasons, maybe it's policy, maybe it's privacy things, maybe it's just, that's never been the way we've done things around here. There are a lot of roadblocks that teams hit in trying to get user feedback and collect that data. So you can kind of see how this cycle begins to form. So if folks don't trust government enough to provide honest feedback, how will we break this cycle? And this is especially true among the groups that the government needs to engage with the most, the people who have historically been left out of conversations and whose communities who feel like their needs haven't been met. So communities like Indigenous communities, Black communities, LGBTQ+ communities, who as a result of being historically underrepresented, underserved, they're even less likely to provide their time and feedback to government teams. But frankly, it's not only these groups that are hesitant to participate in user research and usability testing. More folks in Canada are willing to give their data to private companies and big tech than they are their own government, despite the polar opposite missions of these two sectors. So there's truly a larger systemic problem here. So it's not all bad news. At Code for Canada, we are trying to help to break the cycle. So one way we're trying to do that is through GRIT. GRIT stands for Gathering Resonance to Improve Technology. This is our inclusive user research and user testing service, where we partner with governments, and it allows kind of the design and development teams to uncover challenges, from actual users, discover opportunities to learn from diverse users, and really get into the crunchy bits of like learning about the diverse groups of people using their products and services. Just some background, we founded GRIT in 2017. We did this to promote and demonstrate the value of inclusive testing. We wanted to do this to give real people a voice in building the products and services that are meant for them, because a lot of times these people don't have the ability to provide their voice or lend their voice to the improvement of a product or service. And we wanted to make an explicit channel for them to be heard. We also created it as an alternative to kind of the competitive landscape of like private sector market research firms, often who end up employing professional testers. These are people who, have kind of learned how to like game the system of signing up for these kind of focus groups or research groups to give feedback on, products or services. But they kind of know how to give the feedback that maybe development teams are looking for, they're trying to seek. So they're not giving that kind of real feedback that product teams actually need. And finally, the final great thing about GRIT that we've noticed is that it has been an amazing channel for increasing the engagement between the public sector and actual communities. So this is just a bit exposing a bit behind the scenes of our great testers behind GRIT. When we started GRIT as a prototype, it was in the GTA, or the Greater Toronto area. And we did this by recruiting real people from all walks of life to share their early and ongoing feedback on public products and services that are meant to serve them. The way we do testing, it's conducted in safe, accessible, inclusive environments where they'll also, most importantly, be compensated fairly for their time. GRIT recognized the exclusion of people from a lot of civic technology efforts. So it focused on growing solutions through diversity, the needs of individuals to help solve the needs of larger groups. And it's taken a grassroots approach with rigor and integrity, with an intent to foster positive change in communities. But the story of GRIT, it was slow to start. When we launched it in 2017, when we talk about the digital talent shortage in governments today, when we were talking to people when we launched the service, a lot of folks, especially in governments that we were speaking to, didn't know or value user experience design thinking, usability testing, all of these concepts that I just spoke about earlier that are like really crucial to building good user-centric services. So that kind of like uneducated buyer was quite prevalent and still is today. It has been improving, but it's a very slow progress or evolution. And whenever we were lucky enough to kind of find someone within government that understood the value of testing, it was then actually challenging to convince more internal stakeholders beyond them to help to like make that actually happen. So despite being designed for the public sector, with a few exceptional public sector pioneers, in the beginning, GRIT mostly worked with other nonprofits and private sector partners who understood the value of inclusive usability testing. Anyways, that was then. Now folks are knocking on our door asking about GRIT and its unique approach to user research and usability testing. We're still having trouble partnering with government teams, which is frustrating, advocates of user-driven design within government, in which there are quite a few, as we've noticed over the years. There is a greater emphasis or knowledge of design, design frameworks and design approaches, which is great. But governments being governments, bureaucratic, regulatory guidelines, especially around procurement, kind of continue to be hurdles that we're still working with our partners to attempt to clear. So we're making progress. It's still slow, but it's progress nonetheless. We're trying to find allies and champions. So one of our former collaborators, Sidra Mahmood, they worked with Code for Canada as a designer and then moved into the public service, the government of Canada, to be a designer. They shared this wish list for making it easier to leverage user experience design best practices within government that went beyond the procurement problem. So a couple things to share. One is to truly start to understand the lack of trust and the appropriate intersectional ways to address these challenges. The next one is, less gigantic digital transformation projects, more agile, open source, smaller scoped, user-driven service design kind of projects. Also, building products and services that solve actual problems. This helps to, show users that we listen and that we care, and helps to slowly break that cycle of distrust or reverse the cycle of distrust. And then work more closely with civic society and external partners who center on inclusive civic engagements. So we see that wish list and we are actively working to make it a reality. So what started as a local program, which was GRIT, is now a national service offering. We've taken years of working with government partners and their feedback, and working with many testers and their feedback. And we've evolved GRIT to better serve the needs of public sector partners across the country. We wanted to take a considered approach to respect the people who make up the tester pool, the process we establish and the partners that we serve. And we made some great strides and are focused on dramatically increasing the depth of our tester pool by reflecting, more diverse Canadian demographic segments, and then also focusing on the inclusion of more marginalized groups, traditionally marginalized groups in our country. GRIT is and always has been about providing an opportunity for governments to engage with real people, not professional testers, and just to overall build more effective products and services more ethically and efficiently. So to meet this mission, we're taking the program further outside of the GTA or the Greater Toronto Area, also outside of Ontario, and working on expanding our pool with these areas of focus. We're targeting more rural, northern, remote communities, more Indigenous newcomers, other marginalized represented groups, other groups with accessibility needs and requirements. And we also do kind of custom recruitment by request based on our government partners' needs. So to close out, teams can build their in-house design capacity by recruiting design researchers, forming small testing pools, consistently testing, implementing incremental changes often. We know it's not easy to operate within government constraints, but consider what's at stake, and we need to make that push. So this is what Code for Canada and the Canadian civic tech movement is looking to solve. It's not just about convenience. It's about making Canada more accessible, inclusive, and equitable. And it's about using our incredible talent, especially our digital talent in this country, and our resources to build something better together. Thank you.
So I remind everyone, and thank you very much, Dorothy. I really enjoyed your presentation. It's inspirational and uplifting, and certainly gives me personally a lot of hope for the future of new solutions and new systems. Are there any questions from the floor or from the audience? And if so, please enter them into the Q&A. We have one here, Dorothy. What are the motivating factors you use to convince the government the long-term benefits from investing in the digital transformation in terms of efficiency, data security, customer service, and reducing costs? And what are the challenges in getting support for your arguments?
That is a great question. And it's kind of the $1 million question of our work here at Code for Canada and the theme of this whole event. So if I were to, there's lots of there's lots of things in there. Governments in general are incredibly complex. They have many processes, various policies. They're comprised of various silos. Often those silos might not be working together, or they're even incentivized to not work together or to communicate with each other. And so it is quite challenging when we're thinking of digital transformation to work in an organization or a landscape that doesn't necessarily all align on a common understanding of what is transformation and also why does it need to happen. So I think one of the we have a lot of conversations with different governments across Canada, and every government, regardless of what level they're at, the municipal or the provincial or the federal level, while they all vary in size and jurisdiction, they all kind of generally exhibit the same characteristics, right? Those same kind of silos, those misaligned incentives across different groups, and all similarly. Often, we talk to governments and they're all like, yeah, things need to change. And we have a digital transformation group, or we got this roadmap, or we got this strategy. And more often than not, like a lot of groups are struggling to make progress against those roadmaps and actually prove, like things are moving forward. So it's funny because everybody has a similar kind of mission or goal. Everybody has a similar struggles of being able to move things forward. One piece of that we find is like an effective approach to having those conversations and getting everyone aligned is really around risk. So we think of governments and large bureaucracies like government. They are very familiar with like risk management, right? In fact, a lot of them have very rigorous risk management procedures and project management approaches. And, often there's like, what's the risk of doing this, the risk of doing that, and how are we mitigating these risks? What is a really effective way of reframing that question of risk is actually looking at the flip side of like, well, what's the risk of not doing certain things? So if we're thinking of user research, which was this presentation that I gave, and the importance of starting with users to understand what are the actual problems that people have in accessing a service or understanding a policy or whatever. There might be, within government, a bunch of risks that are laid out. If we do user research, there's a risk that, like it's impossible to kind of do it because there's a privacy risk. There's like a risk around like, we're going to be way over our timeline because now we got to like incorporate user research and we did not account for that. There's a risk on budget. There's a risk on even like reputation, right? Like there's a risk of going out to the public and being perceived in a certain way by the public. There's a lot of like fear of doing things versus if you kind of flip it of like, what's the risk of not doing user research? Well, then it's assuming, then we got to make a lot of assumptions about what the problem is. And likely what's going to happen is that those assumptions are probably will be invalidated, right? They're not, those are assumptions made by groups of people within government that aren't familiar with what's happening in the real world. And so the risk of not doing user research might be, well, we spend months and months designing and delivering a technology platform, a system transformation that ends up actually not even being used or not being adopted, or it's not, and that goes way over budget or way over timeline. So ultimately, it's this. It's interesting because, when we think of governments, we often think of risk management, and maybe they are really good at managing risk, versus like flipping that a bit and considering, well, what are they missing, right? Like, what are they not considering in their risk registers or their risk profiles? Oh, I think you're talking, Stephen, but I think you're muted. Oh, I don't know if you heard me, Stephen, but you are muted.
I was doing so well. Have you made progress in the hurdles of getting through government procurement so that GRIT 2.0 can be readily leveraged?
That's a great question. Sometimes, not yet to the point where we've opened the floodgates and we've got many governments coming to us being like, yes, like we want to do inclusive user research with real residents. We have made there are kind of pockets of hope, or like where kind of like miracles happen. I don't want to call like getting through procurement, getting a thing approved by procurement as a miracle, but it's a lot of work, right? To not just say like as the business team that has received approval on a budget to conduct user research. There's then the next hurdle of going out to procure like a support in getting that user research done. And part of that is then educating the procurement office or the procurement director on, what is testing and why does that need to be done, and how have all the risks been accounted for in this decision. So it's, I would say with procurement teams, it's still an ongoing process of having conversations. And as I mentioned, we've had a couple engagements with governments who their procurement teams have, they've approved it, they've checked the box, and we're great. We're off doing user research with, or helping our governments do user research. And so I would say in those instances, often those jurisdictions, they had some form of like more flexible procurement option, maybe one that is often, the other thing to share is that often our GRIT tests fall, under kind of a sole source threshold signing limit. So we've been fortunate to kind of, use that to help get teams what they need to do good user research. So we've like had that privilege. We've also, I mentioned like some governments have worked with their procurements to like set up more flexible procurement options. A good example is the BC government in British Columbia. They have a procurement, their procurement, their digital services procurement program is called Sprint With Us. So they're always looking for kind of like collaborative projects with vendors that align with the digital service standards of like, starting with users, designing first with users. And so they've kind of like adhered to their digital service standards by bringing procurement along to make sure that those align with the service standards.
Okay, great. So I'm going to echo Rosalie's comment when she says very inspirational, and then she has a question. Shouldn't we build this inclusive design capacity in government instead of relying on external service providers?
Absolutely. So I think ultimately at the end of the day, which is our vision and mission at Code for Canada, is ultimately building that digital capacity of government so that they are able to do these things on their own, right? Like if governments had access to all of the user researchers they could in the tech talent pipeline. Amazing. Like, that's great. First, there's like a talent thing. Then it's like, if governments had policies in place that enabled user research with diverse communities, and most importantly, compensated those testers for their feedback, that would be great too. Because again, like, these are like that compensation piece, as much as maybe some governments are thinking, well, like, we can't compensate, people should just want to give their feedback if we ask them for it. That is not an equitable approach, because again, as I mentioned earlier, there are many marginalized communities who already feel like their voices are not valued by governments. And so the act of compensating is an important one, especially with those individuals who feel like they have lost trust in their governments. So yeah, if trust was restored, policies were in place, talent was not an issue, our hypothesis is that, well, then, like, Code for Canada wouldn't even need to be here, which is ultimately what we're trying to work towards, a vision where governments are self-sustaining and able to design and implement those programs and services on their own. But what we are noticing is that they struggle with that. And so but because of these things that I'm mentioning, like the tech talent pipeline, a lot of user researchers who are, hired into the public sector at large tech companies and who are compensated, at market value, that's where they get attracted to, right? And so a lot of them don't end up seeing government as a viable career option. And so this is where Code for Canada comes in. Like, we are an external nonprofit working in the public interest, and we're able to attract like tech talent to see that there is like an opportunity to work on projects that are impactful without needing to compromise. Like they do take some pay cut, but not like a massive pay cut. I think, like, ultimately, yes, one day it would be amazing, and we are working towards that to be the ultimate end goal of governments themselves can conduct user research in an inclusive way that considers inclusive voices. So far, we're seeing a lot of barriers for governments to be able to do that on their own without some form of support from an external group.
Thank you. So I have a self-serving question to ask of you. So I have mobility issues, and I'm heartened by the Ontarians with Disabilities Act, if you're familiar with that. Are there synergies here, or are there things that you can do to help not just me, but other people that have whatever disabilities or limitations in their lives?
Yes, so actually there are, speaking of AODA, the Ontario Disabilities Act, and how that shows up in digital service delivery and from an end user perspective. So every employee that's based in Ontario is required to take like AODA training. That goes the same for, within the Ontario government, the provincial government. They're mandated so that every, IT service, public facing website has to adhere to AODA requirements, which is great. And so there are, we do some accessibility testing for us. We usually focus on the less complex use cases. So, we've worked with governments before on like with low vision users. That's one that is, given our mandate of looking for inclusive testers or like diverse tester pool, we also have to like consider, okay, like what is realistic within our realm of competency and confidence, right? And so certain disability needs are ones that we can easily support. Some of them, are beyond or outside of our sophistication or maturity. And so there are groups that are working in this space. Actually, I don't know if you know of Stephen, Fable Labs. That is a testing group that specifically focuses on accessibility, works with a lot of governments to help make to test the accessibility of their websites and services. Those my maybe not quick answer.
Great, thanks. Two more questions. says, good answers, thank you. I find the lack of awareness, cost, resistance to change, security concerns seem to be challenges I've encountered. You experience these challenges.
Sorry, wait, could you repeat the question? My audio cut out.
Sure. The question, thank you. I find the lack of awareness, cost, resistance to change, security concerns seem to be challenges this person encountered. Do you experience these challenges?
Yes, definitely. Those, I heard cost, I heard resistance to change, I heard, what were the two?
Security.
Security, yes. And I
That
can't
was
remember.
it. There's a,
Oh, maybe those three are good.
Yeah.
Yes, all of those are challenges we've heard many times. On the cost one, you know, the cost of doing user research is obviously something that a lot of teams don't budget for, because what a lot of, you know, the way project planning happens in government, it's let's define all the requirements. We've made a bunch of assumptions about what the problem is. We made all the assumptions of what the solution is. Let's go out and hire a vendor to do it. Great. So that approach, as I've just described, is kind of like shortcuts past user research. It's what really understanding, like, okay, well, where did the requirements come from, and what drove our assumptions? So when, and if you're familiar with like IT project development, what I just described there is like waterfall. That's like described as waterfall. If you think about kind of the, I don't know if you've all seen like the graph of like value over time, but you know, the approach of waterfall is that like over time, you don't do a lot of testing. You just kind of like build and build and build and build. And then at the end, boom, you've launched a thing and you assume, oh, it's met all the requirements. We'll test it with users at the end. And there's all our value at the very end. What you can gather from that approach is that the risk of that approach is just climbing every day, right? As you're not testing with users immediately or asking users for their feedback, they are not being incorporated into validating that these assumptions are true. And so at the end, the cost is extremely high because the risk is high. And so likely that thing that's launched at the end is not going to meet the user's need. So on the cost side, there's actually a clear counter narrative, which is that if we go out and we invest in this small amount of user research, right? We compensate people. It's like $1 an hour for their feedback, or sorry, not an hour, sorry, $1 a minute. So like $60 an hour, sit down with 10 people, you know, and invest in that activity up front, and like get some designers to like help us to gather the data, to make sense of the data. That is a small fraction of likely what this project budget is. But what it does is it greatly reduces the risk of, at the end, of launching a product that actually didn't even meet the needs that the team was trying to meet. So the cost argument is one that we hear all the time, but it's through the education of, again, what is risk and what are we scared of, and how do we help to reduce the risk by actually realizing that user research is a key way of doing that. What was the other one? I could tackle maybe another one. I can't remember though.
Well, we have another question, sort of ties
Okay,
into that.
let's do that. Yeah.
Okay. So you warn against big bang projects, but without them, we stay with ad hoc projects that do not get rolled out. What is the middle approach?
Ad hoc projects that do not get rolled out. Oh, interesting. So that is, I would say, maybe the observation of the collection of small ad hoc projects that maybe don't lead up to anything substantial or strategic or of value is also like kind of poor project planning. Like both of these examples that were just listed of like big bang approach versus a bunch of small projects that don't go anywhere. Those are both pointing to essentially a lack of honestly like a lack of good leadership, which is that like, you know, again, if we're laser focused on the outcomes we're trying to achieve across the organization, which is, you know, better service for our end users, maybe we want to like reduce the drop off of callers at our call centers at this point of the process, or maybe we want to, you know, improve user satisfaction rates with this service. Whatever that metric is that is user centric, that is driven by, you know, whether users are going to return to the system and use it, and also then, you know, and that's completely like correlated with trust in a government or a system, then that is what will drive the project scoping. So again, like by being user focused, it would walk us out of doing the big bang approach, because we would start with users. By being user focused, we also went kind of like, you know, waste our time making assumptions about like, let's do a small project here, let's do a small project here. We would, all those small projects not leading to anything is also lack of prioritization, because they're not leadership or across the organization, the team is not prioritized on what the real problems are with users. So if it started with user research, again, you get very clear, okay, this is what everybody is complaining about. Let's start with that proof of concept, that project, tackling that thing first, and then work our way down like the priority list.
Excellent. Thank you. And I'd like to thank everyone for their great questions. Dorothy, and I'd like to thank you for such an inspirational, motivational, thought-provoking presentation. I loved it. So on behalf of everyone in the DGIT conference, we really appreciate your sharing your thoughts and your ideas with us.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
It was a pleasure being here.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.